An old book. Book about witchcraft.
You're listening to the Whitewood Podcast, a show about mystery schools, the occult, and witchcraft.
Would you like to have a look around?
Why have you come to Whitewood?
Well, because I'm interested in witchcraft.
I'm your host, Nate. Come with us as we delve into the history, techniques, and backstories of these traditions and the people who practice them.
Welcome back to the Whitewood Podcast. I'm your host, Nate Driscoll, and this week we are going to be talking about symbols, how to utilize symbols, why we use symbols, and what are some of the pre-established symbols that you might find yourself using, hopefully to also describe enough technique that you're not constricted to pre-existing symbols, that you could either utilize your own symbols or use symbols from something else in order to have effects, and what is really the purpose of that. I would say that the use of symbols is a cornerstone in the occult. It's one of the foundational practices. It's going to very quickly find itself related to many, many other fields. You're going to find that the use of symbols is going to be used in things like ritual and altars. It's also going to be used in mythology and in a whole bunch of different practices. And so I definitely wouldn't think that symbols is stuck as only symbols. I would say that it opens the door to being able to use a lot of different things, but we wanted to talk about some of this basic foundational stuff first so that we have a foundation to build up for more complicated conversations as we talk about, some of the topics that require a little bit more of an in-depth examination. So, to start off with, what the hell's a symbol, right? Well, a symbol is a thing that represents or stands for something else, especially a material object representing something abstract. That's a definition that we pulled off of dictionary.com. But it gives a couple of examples, and then it gives some similar words, and I think it's really important to kind of play with these ideas, right? So the example that they give is that the limousine was another symbol of wealth and authority. I think that's a pretty good idea as to how a symbol operates. You have a physical object, and it doesn't have to be a physical object. It could be things that are a little more abstract, representing things that are more abstract, like a color might represent an, I don't know. They say when you get angry, you see red. So a lot of times in movies and media, they will portray anger as red. So that might be an example of something where it's not necessarily a thing, like a limousine representing wealth, right? It could be a color representing something. A great example of a color, to continue on the idea of red, is when you're driving through town and you see those lights that are hung from strings up above your head, and one of them flashes a light that says the color red, and you stop your vehicle. And when we really break down what's happening, the light does not physically stop your car. You stop your car because you have interpreted the symbol that is the red light as a symbol for it's time to stop your vehicle. So there's symbols all around us. There's also symbols for things like nationalities, where you have like a flag or a national emblem that might include like an animal. Like a lot of countries have their national birds and their state flower and their things like that, where you might, when you really break down what a flag is just a piece of cloth that has some color and some patterns on it. It in itself is not the nation, right? But when you look at that flag, you have some connotation for what you believe that it stands for. That flag is a symbol of your nation, and generally it's a symbol of your nation as you interpret it. That's going to become a really important part as we talk about symbols, is that a lot of it is going to be up to your personal interpretation of that symbol. And as you explore symbols, you'll find that you're kind of in the driver's seat for how much you interpret something in one direction or the other. For example, if you use that flag analogy, you might find that your nation's flag, I don't know, to you it's associated with very positive, happy things, and you see all the light that is your national history, and you might react to that symbol in a positive light. In the same way, you might only view the downside, all of the terrible atrocities that I'm sure every nation at some point has committed. You might interpret that symbol, that flag, as a symbol of those negative things, and so you might have a negative reaction to the symbol. So even though the symbol is the same for both individuals, you'll find that different individuals react differently to it, and then it's a very subjective experience. It has to do with how an individual interprets it. Of course, you can widen those horizons. You could, spend time in contemplation of a symbol in order to kind of really dive into expanding the boundary of what that symbol really means to you. So in the case of that flag, you might spend some time learning some history of that country, and over time, your perception on that might change in one direction or the other, or it might deepen and become more. Generally, I would suggest, trying to see every facet of it, every side of it, and have a very balanced view of each symbol. But of course, every individual is willing to make their own choices, and I hope that they, I hope that they do whatever is working and making them the best individual, not necessarily doing what's making me the best individual by my own definition. Define yourself. Don't let me define you. Some similar words to symbols that you might hear is like an emblem or representation or an image of something, a metaphor, an allegory. Those kind of things are, in a way, they are symbols of the word symbol. That's funny. They're synonyms of the idea. So you might have a metaphor that's relating to a greater idea, and that might be a symbolic representation of that. And we often see those kind of things used in spiritual settings. For example, it's probably pretty common knowledge that when Christ taught his messages, that they were taught in allegory and metaphor, that many times someone would ask a direct question, and his response would not be, "Oh yeah, of course, Dave." It would much more be, "Let me tell you a story. A man was walking by the side of the road and encountered," and that's, it's a powerful tool, symbols and metaphor, and how you can convey very deep meanings in very small symbols. You can compact a lot of ideas into a very, very, very small space. And I think that's one of the reasons why symbols is so potent and powerful, is that by adding our own willingness to dive into and expand and unfold those symbols, we can find ourselves creeping back into the same message over and over and over again, but finding more and more depth within it. So that's a very valuable practice, in my opinion. Now, when we talk about symbols in the occult, what we're saying is that by utilizing the power that is symbolic language and that unfolding aspect, that we can explore the divine, number one, in a way that allows us to move between different religious perceptions. We can spend some time in one religion and spend some time in another, and not be hypocrites, because we can treat it as, I'm learning what other people's symbols are and how they interact with the divine and how they interact with spirituality in general, but still be able to unfold some of that deeper message and meaning that we can find into our life. Another reason why symbol is really interesting is that because it is subjective and built around the personal interpretation, you're not limited to intended symbolism. You can go out and find symbols in the world that were not placed there specifically for you. So while reading into, let's say you're in like a college class where you're talking about like a specific narrative, like let's say there's a specific author that you're looking at, and they want to dissect, kind of the deeper side of it, and they say, hey, Dickens was obviously here symbolically talking about this, and how does that relate to the times and to the philosophy of the area that he's living in. And they might try to unpack some of that symbolism, and that might be something where it's like intended symbolism. But you also might find that there is symbolism that is not purposefully put there. That is, like you might, I don't know, go sit by a lake and just be taking in the scenery and thinking about some kind of an idea, and your mind might attach onto a naturally occurring symbol. Maybe a bird flies down, or maybe a squirrel runs by, or maybe you just observe a tree or leaf in a specific pattern. Something might call out to you, and your subconscious might say, hey, look, really pay attention to this, because this is a really good symbol for whatever idea you're playing around with currently. And you might find naturally occurring symbols to be a valuable way to receive and explore the concept of spirituality and the divine. Find meaning in that. Now, that opens up the door, of course. I think that all symbols should be used within the bounds that you can. So, what types of things would you do with a symbol? So you have these symbols. You recognize how to, interact with them out in space, out in the world. You find that, you can depthen your relationship with the divine using them. What kinds of things could you use, either for the purpose of controlling some of yourself and your surroundings, or just to explore some of that divine connection? So one of the first things that I would suggest with any symbol is to meditate on it, to take a symbol and use that symbol as your focal point for your meditation. Try to hold that idea within your mind for as long as possible. And then I would argue that meditation is not the silencing of ideas, that they are going to happen. You are going to be in the middle of a meditation practice, and then somewhere in the back of your head, your mind's going to go, look, we should watch Netflix. Oh, it's really interesting. Hey, we read that book the other day. Oh, what's really cool? Hey, did you think about that? And that's normal. That's part of meditation, is to, number one, disengage from those thoughts, to not follow them, to allow them to kind of come in and leave all of their own accord, to disassociate your own self-identity with your thoughts, and instead watch the thoughts enter, watch them leave, and just continue doing what you were doing. The example that I have often heard that I really like is you're holding a bowl of water, and your goal is to make the water still. And there's a little bit of waves in the water that occur naturally, whether that's the tremors of your hand or the wind blowing by or whatever has caused these tremors. And it sure as hell doesn't help for you to try to smack the waves down as you are trying to calm the pool of water. Instead, it helps to just let the waves dissipate on their own and let them go and observe them and try to hold still, as opposed to smacking water down and expecting waves to disappear, because that's a great way to make more ripples and some splashes and just drop your bowl of water. So to use the symbol as the focal point of the meditation, similar to how you might use like a mantra, like maybe you would say a specific mantra over and over and over again. You could hold an idea, a color, an image, a shape, an animal, whatever the symbol is that you're trying to interact with. You could hold that in your mind's eye for as long as possible. Then as you drift away from it, what I would suggest, because it's going to happen, what I would suggest is that you, instead of going, oh gosh darn it, I have messed up, that's all just new thoughts. You're just adding to the situation. That's you smacking the water down. Much better to just, as soon as you recognize that you have drifted from the symbol that you were meditating on, to just let go back to the symbol, and continue on your meditation. A lot of times when I'm doing this, I will set a timer so that I hit a specific amount of time, and I can get rid of that anxiety of, have I done this long enough? That brings a lot of thoughts to my mind of like, how long have I been doing this? How long? Well, no, dude, you've set aside some time just to accomplish it. One thing I want to mention before we dive into too much of these different ways to use a symbol is that it's very possible that you hear something a little interesting as we go through these, and you're like, man, that's interesting. I never really thought about it like that. I'd like to learn more. But gosh darn it, Nate only talked about super surface level, or maybe there was one thing that he said that was like really enlightening to me, and I wish he would have kept talking on that exact topic for an hour. Well, most of these talking points are going to be their own episodes. So we are absolutely going to dive much, much deeper into meditation, and hopefully even bring on a guest to talk about their experiences with meditation. So have no fear. We will get much more in depth on how you might use that symbol. So how might that affect you? So let's say you have a symbol in your mind, and we'll talk about some symbols that you might potentially use. What might happen? Well, let's say the symbol that you're using is for some kind of, I don't know, empowerment seems to be a common goal. Another powerful goal is, to bring love into your life by becoming a more loving individual. So let's say the loving individual one is our example. Let's say we're going to meditate on some symbol of love that we've come up with. The more often you do this, the more you train your mind towards this, you might find yourself inviting that energy into your life, that opening the door in your mind towards love, compassion. You might also use this meditation to go through some of the symbolic journeys that a lot of great spiritual individuals have suggested over the years. There are some obvious examples in mainstream religion. The Buddha wrote on a couple of specific meditations that you could, and contemplations as well, not just meditations, that would lead to some specific result. There's also some in Christianity. You could meditate on like a specific myth, a specific lesson that was taught. You might find yourself, using maybe some of the Greek myths as an example. There's a whole plethora of things that you might find yourself meditating on, but the long-term effect would be that you're opening your mind and yourself up to that energy, training yourself to have a relationship with it. So if you were meditating on a symbol of love, let's say, I don't know, what's a good symbol of love? A dove, I guess, maybe is a good example. So you're meditating on the symbol of a dove, and then every day you sit down and you meditate on a symbol of a dove, and as you do, you start to find, a sense of peace and love entering your life. That would be an example of what you might expect from a meditation like that on a symbol. Another example might be dreaming. We are most definitely going to talk about dreaming, because dreaming is one of the areas where I'm the most passionate, where I have found just a lot of really interesting things. I love it. I think it's fantastic. But to just kind of at the surface, what might we do with dreaming? Well, if you're lucid dreaming and you're at that state where you can create symbols, you might be able to invite certain things into your life, similar to how we would do with meditation, by going about your dream pretending like you're not lucid dreaming, which can be difficult sometimes because it's a great way to slip out of lucidity and back into just standard dreaming. And we'll talk about some of those techniques and how to do those kind of things in a later episode for sure, because it's definitely one of my passions. But you might introduce some of those symbols into the narrative that's already happening within the dream to kind of directly impose your will into your subconscious Another thing that you might do is you might be a little less sneaky about it. You might, blatantly change the dream into whatever symbols very, very overtly. Your subconscious is going to be aware that that's happening if you do it that way. So it won't be so much of you implanting an idea. It'll be much more of a conversation where yourself and your subconscious might be able to symbolically communicate back and forth. Although some people have found that second one sometimes leads to waking up because of the subconscious resisting that happening, trying to put you back to sleep, and thus sometimes becoming aggressive. But it's okay. You're safe there. Nothing really happens. It's all good. So let's see. What would be another example? Rituals. Rituals are, man, I cannot speak highly enough of using symbols in ritual settings. Some really good examples might be like the Gnostic Mass, where there are like physical objects, as well as the practitioners that are used in the Mass, are all kind of symbolic. And the playing field, the shape of everything, that's all symbolic. Where the altars are all laid out. In Gnostic Mass, there's more than one altar. Where those altars are lined up, each one of the individuals, how they're dressed. These are all symbols that all kind of come together for one celebration of sacred truth, celebration of the mysteries. And in that case, you are very much, this is a form of celebration, but there are other kinds of rituals that might be more of an engagement with some of those mysteries and some of those universal truths. But in the case of Mass, there's like, for example, there's like a water dish that's used in it, and that water dish is symbolic, and the water that's in it is symbolic, and the priestess will say things to explain the symbols. She'll say, I take this and I take this and I mix them, and this is symbolic of this, and present it as part of the ritual energetic change. And in ritual, what we observe happening is by engaging with these symbols in that way, through a principle that is often broken down to as above, so below. You'll find that by shifting something in the small things that's on the altar, you're shifting the larger energies that are in the room and in the space. And so you can invite pretty powerful energies by doing a thing on a table with purpose and meaning. Obviously, it doesn't just happen, it happens to some extent. It doesn't happen for the most part as you're just going about your daily life, interacting with objects. But when you set aside time in a sacred space and you symbolically go through manipulating objects, then you often find very profound changes in the energy settings, psychologies of the individuals that are observing and taking part in that ritual. So ritual gives us a lot of power over things, and we often use that as a place to celebrate the sacred, celebrate the mysteries, and really kind of, I don't know, hopefully change ourselves for the better. That would be the prime goal in my mind. I suppose everyone is willing to, or is everyone is capable of coming up with their own definition of what their goal should be, and I would encourage people to explore their own intent as opposed to my intent. But hopefully you come around to a similar perspective that this is a fantastic system for self-growth, and you could get a lot of self-growth out of it. What are some other rituals? Changing the seasons is a good example of another ritual. So in Wiccan settings, let's say it is kind of that peak season where it's like the most spring that it's going to be. Seasons aren't just one day it is spring and the next day it is summer. there's a transition, there's an overlap between seasons. You find that spring slowly gives way to summer, and then summer builds up and slowly gives way to fall, right? There's like an ebb and flow to it. And so in Wiccan traditions and in some pagan traditions, depending on the pagan tradition, you will find they have rituals and rites that are based around changing the seasons, that are based on the celebration of that natural cycle. Again, similar to Gnostic Mass, it would be kind of perceived as a ritual celebration of something that they consider to be sacred and divine. I would agree with them in a lot of points, but I myself am not Wiccan. But I would agree that that natural cycle is sacred, and that they're pretty on point with that celebration. I would strongly encourage anybody open-minded enough to at least go, politely and reverently observe if they get an opportunity to be invited to something like that. Maybe it's for you, and you find, this new family that encourages your personal spiritual growth. And maybe it's not. Maybe it's just you got to observe a culture that you weren't really aware was out there, and, connect with some of the people that are in your community, because if you are not actively practicing the occult, or specifically Wicca, there is someone in your neighborhood who is. And so to bridge that gap and make people one community that are of all different backgrounds, I think is really important. So similar to how I might be willing to, go to my friend's temple or something like that, I would totally encourage others to, check out a changing the seasons ritual, and that celebration, and really, open the idea of those symbols and what they might, represent for those people, and why they consider that to be sacred. Another ritual that deals heavily with symbols and is a foundational work for ceremonial magic and magic in general because of it, is the lesser ritual, the pentagram, sometimes done in its banishing form, sometimes in its invocating form. So it might be something referred to as the lesser banishing ritual. The pentagram is probably its most common form. But in general, you could just call it the lesser ritual, the pentagram, because it comes in multiple varieties. Through the lesser banishing ritual, the pentagram, individuals invoke 4 entities to stand at the 4 quarters. And generally speaking, the original symbology of how it was written and published the first couple of times was using very Judaic symbols of like the 4 archangels, one at each corner. There's elemental symbolism in it. So you might have like a specific element like air at the east and water at the west. So there's some symbolism that has to do with not just the position of the one element. There's symbols as to how one is on one side and one is on the other, and there's a balance between those. That might, potentially be something that is worth exploring, how these different directions are picked on purpose towards, different elements in different locations. There's also symbols of like shapes that are taken into account. The 5-pointed star or the 6-pointed star. What are those symbolic of? The whole thing takes place in a circle. What is that symbolic of? There are motions in the beginning where you might draw certain shapes on oneself, drawing light in from the light itself is symbolic. So that's, really just constantly smashing as many. When you talk about ceremonial ritual magic, a lot of times what you're doing is smashing as many symbols into a small space as physically possible in order to evoke very potent and powerful energies, and sometimes even setting the stage for an energy to exist, where you might use, like in the case of LBRP, you might use 4 energies to set the stage for a 5th to enter, because the 5th exists in a way which it needs a empowered and clean space in order to enter. So that would be a great example of a ritual that is just packed with symbols. And I would argue that that one in particular is a giant rabbit hole, that every motion, every word spoken is a symbol all in itself, and that the symbolic journey of going from each of those symbols into the next symbol is an extra layer of symbols, and then it's just kind of crammed all together at once. And that's a pretty powerful experience. I've definitely benefited pretty heavily from experimenting with that one. I would encourage others to do the same. But as I mentioned, that one is using very Judaic symbols. Some people struggle to utilize Judaic symbols. In my opinion, a lot of that stems from certain Abrahamic traditions having individuals, members, who have, acted rudely or in several points in history, even violently, towards other groups. And people superimposing the blame of the actions of the individual onto the religion itself. I would say that, all religions are coming from a place of trying to experiment with the divine and engage with the divine. So I would bring them to the table personally and allow them to, be a part of everything. But I know that sometimes people have a little bit of a chip on their shoulder from specifically Christianity, if you live in a highly Christian area. And I can understand why it might make it complicated for you to open your mind and heart up to a symbol that, LBRP is just dripping in. LBRP was written in a way where it offers the opportunity, and for more information about this, you can go into, Liber O Vel Manus, which is commonly referred to as Liber O. If you just look up Liber O, you'll probably find it online. But in Liber O, the first publishing of LBRP, you can, it instructs you on how you might swap symbols out, how you might take, this Christian themed and do the exact same ritual, but do it maybe in an Egyptian theme or a Greek theme, or whatever's working for you. So if there are symbols that work a little bit better for you, that is an option for you to experience it in a slightly different way that maybe works a little bit better for you and is less emotionally disruptive. That might bring your own challenges to the board and be able to still utilize those symbols. So that is an option. Other than ritual, what are some other things that we can do to interact with symbols? A really common one is altars. A lot of people, especially in the occult world, will maintain a permanent dedicated altar or a temporary altar where maybe we don't have the physical space, or there's some privacy concerns. An altar is definitely considered to be a sacred thing. And so maybe you live with some roommates who you don't trust to be respectful of your religious practice. And so maybe you don't want to leave an altar up all the time because you're worried that they might disrespect it in a way that makes it difficult to leave something permanently up. Or maybe you just haven't come out as somebody that's a member of the occult, and you're worried that someone is going to see that altar and is going to judge or react in a negative way to that altar. So there's definitely times where you might find that there are temporary altars. But a lot of people, as they acquire the space and the materials to do so, will have a full dedicated altar that is out all the time in some space, whether that's outdoors. I've seen quite a few outdoors. I've seen some that are within the home. And then depending on the religious variety, you might find that comes in a lot of different forms. It might be a single shelf on a bookshelf that, somebody leaves offerings to the Buddha or something. It might be a maybe like a little bit more of like this is a whole table that we use, or the top of this is used to, build up to this one deity, or maybe it's an altar for just general use, right? For general spell work, where you might have like more of the tools of the trade sitting there, and in the times when you're using it, it's all there, and in the times that it's not, it's still sitting there, prepared and cleansed and dedicated to that purpose. On an altar, you got a lot of examples of symbols. I would say that each one of what you call the magical weapons, that would be the items that are used for spell work. So like an incense burner, or a sacred knife that you use for knives during rituals, for cutting implements or whatever. A wand, sword is a common magical weapon. Discs, like the pentacle, or sometimes people use like a coin. There's a lot of different options of things that might go on the altar, but each and every one of them is a symbol. Each of every one of them has its purpose within the larger symbol, which is on the altar. You're creating a symbolic representation of the universe as you understand it on there. And so as you make changes to that symbol, you're either unfolding your own understanding of that symbol, because now suddenly the symbol has become more complicated. That's on your, has opened up and developed. Or you might make changes to the universe by saying, here is this symbol of, I don't know, what would be a good example? Here's a symbol of myself, and I'm trying to lose weight. And maybe I have like a clay representation of myself, and I could take, like a knife, and I could write a word on the knife that says like, cardio. And then I could literally shave off part of the clay in order to lose that weight, to, shift the energies in my situation in order to encourage that weight loss. So maybe that's an example of how someone might symbolically use an altar, either to one of my favorite things to do with it is just to have it, to keep it prepared, to keep it in a sacred mindset. My altar, I never place anything down on it without specific intent. So I also wouldn't suggest touching anyone else's altar. It's very, very rude. So if you find yourself maybe around some people who have an altar, it's perfectly fine to look at it. If you notice like, oh, hey, that's kind of interesting. I really like that little statue there. And oh, that's a cool little incense burner. You might turn to your friend and say, hey, would you be offended if I were to pick this up? I think this is a really interesting thing. Can I look at it? And they might say, no, that wouldn't be appropriate. I wouldn't feel okay with that. That's okay. Respect your friends. But they also might invite you into that space where they are saying, yeah, that's acceptable. You can pick it up, but please treat it with respect. Because those items that are on the table, the table itself, the altar itself, is a symbolic representation of their universe, of their world, their life. And if you were to pick something up and disrespect it, you'd be disrespecting a part of their life and the sanctity of the symbol. And that could, hurt their feelings. And potentially, depending on how everything is set up, it could disrupt their ability to use the symbol as they see fit. So, yeah. So that's some of the way that you might find yourself using altars. Now on to some of the other ways that you might utilize a symbol. An obvious one that gets used a lot, not just in the occult world, but just in general, is writing, performing, reading narratives. So a narrative would be, some kind of a story that's being told, and the symbols might find their way into that story. Now, like I said, doesn't necessarily have to be an occult thing when it comes to reading symbols, writing symbols. You could, like, let's say you're in college and you're in a class where you're going over some of the literary classics, and they're talking about like, oh yeah, do you see how Dickens incorporated this theme and this idea, which is, symbolic of the times that he was in, and do you see how this character went about this, story arc, and how, so that might be an example. Or like Animal Farm is a pretty good example of a symbolic, it's a story about a bunch of animals, but it's really a story about the Soviet Union and communism and, some of the terrible things that happen there. So that might be an example of something that's non-occult, non-religious, that you can see how symbols can work their way into narratives and can be a really big part of that. But back into the occult concepts, writing and performing narratives might show up in like the Bible, for example, or like the Bhagavad Gita, or like an actual formal religious text could go over some symbolic meanings. For example, when anytime that like Christ is asked a question in the Bible, he never answers the question directly. He always answers it with a narrative. People will be like, "Hey, but should we be like this?" And instead of being like, "No, Dave, you shouldn't be like that," or like, "Yeah, totally, Dave, of course," he's always like, "Oh, let me answer that with a story. There was once a man. He was walking down the road, and he encountered," So you can see how religious meaning can be symbol that's put into written word, and that can be a pretty profoundly powerful way of communicating a message. One of the reasons why it works so well is because there is that subjective interpretation of the symbol, so you can read into it farther and farther, and you can find how it applies to whatever it is that you're currently going through. So I think that's one of the reasons why people read sacred texts when they're trying to, make decisions about their own life, is they'll go and they'll read, some symbolic thing. And I think sometimes people read too much into it, and other times I think it's, definitely there. But what ends up happening is the individual goes, "Man, I don't know what to do about this situation that I'm in." And then they go and they read a religious text, and they unpackage one of the ideas a little bit. They unfold that symbol, and then they go, "Man, this is exactly like the situation that I'm in right now. This is a really..." And sometimes it is. Sometimes it is a really similar thing because, thousands of years ago when people wrote these ideas, they wrote them down because they were meaningful, because they were profound, because they applied to a bunch of different scenarios. And otherwise, the books wouldn't have survived. They wouldn't have continued to pass it down because they would have been like, "Man, this is the rantings of a madman. This has nothing to do with how we should live our lives." But instead, these books get passed down because they do have some important symbols in them. One of the sources that you might find for learning more about that kind of stuff is Carl Jung. Wrote some books on symbolism and the psyche, and how the subconscious and how religion is all wrapped together in religious materials. Some of it is definitely through his own personal interpretation, but a lot of it is just really interesting stuff to kind of explore. There's also some professors that have, thrown together some classes that are on religious symbolism, and you can find a lot of that stuff for free online. YouTube, great source for college lectures. So if you wanted to dive more into religious symbolism, there's definitely some options. Included in some of that religious stuff would be like mythological, like the Greeks, for example. The Greeks had like symbols. Even like some of the monsters that they slay would be like symbols of something. Like Midas being that symbol of greed. Everything he touches turns to gold, and he finds that it doesn't really make him happy, being like a symbolic story to kind of convey this message that, seeking wealth everywhere is not going to make you happy. That, you could find wealth everywhere, but you sure would be missing out on some of the things that you love. So that might be an example of, religious symbolism being, a narrative that exists, written down. Also like the chimera, being this like, it's a snake, but it's also a lion. It's got eagle wings and talons, and it's like all the scary things if you're living in the, in the wilderness around Greece. It's like all the stuff that can hurt you and hunt you and all the predators and wrapped all into one. So it's like symbolic of that chaos and death that is, out there. And so that could be a really good example of how symbols might work their way into religious texts. Another thing that's kind of down that same road of religious narratives is initiations, initiatory rites. Now, I have been through initiations. I have taken oaths to not talk about the specifics of an initiation, and I intend not just with my own word on this show, but also any time I have a guest on to honor those oaths that I've taken to protect that information. So I won't dive into specifics, but I can say, the practice of initiations is something that happens all over. There's a whole bunch of different groups that do it. There's religious organizations that are, occult-minded, like the OTO, the AA, various covens. They all might have some form of an initiatory practice. There's non-occult fraternal organizations like the Freemasons or, the Shriners or, those kind of organizations. They have initiations. You might have, there's initiations in a lot of different aspects in life and a lot of different groups. And basically what an initiation is there's some form of a ritual, rite, narrative that an individual, an initiate, gets brought into. They get kind of walked through in the same manner that everyone else that's in the room has been walked through. Everyone that's part of that special club has at some point gone through this initiation. And it's some kind of a symbolic story that is supposed to draw your attention towards certain meanings and things of import. They are kept secret, and they're not kept secret because of I think there's this perception from the outside world, anyone that's never been initiated to anything, there's this perception that it's either elitism, that oh yeah, we only initiate people that are cool enough to be in our cool secret club, and that's definitely not what I've seen. Of course, I'm sure there's some organization out there that acts that way, but that's definitely not what my experience with initiation has been. It's definitely not kept secret because it's immoral or anything like that. It's very much kept secret because it is considered to be sacred, because it is something that is of high import, and we don't want profaned and joked about, because it is something that we consider to be meaningful, and we want to help protect that meaning and carry it with love and respect. So I would, if you're interested in initiation, I would say probably the smartest thing to do would not be to go out seeking whatever the script is, because you really just rob yourself of the experience if you were to find that right out there. The best thing to do would be to, inquire with some initiatory group that you're interested in. How could I go about becoming a member? And you might find out about initiations in a more organic sense. It happens from time to time that I'm reading some books that I've collected over the years, and they get to a section that they actually write down, what the initiatory practice is of the group. If it's a group that is still currently practicing, regardless of whether I currently intend to initiate with that group, I always skip their initiation chapters. Because, number one, I understand that they, that actual group is probably trying to keep a sense of respect and to that. And so it's very possible that the author is, violating that trust. So I don't want to be a part of that. That's part of why I'll skip through it. but also so that I keep the door open for myself to be able to go through that, so that, maybe I'm not super interested in this one particular group today, but maybe in 10 years I find, hey, I am kind of interested in that group. I would like to learn more and be a part of that. And if I already know their initiatory practices, then I rob myself of the experience, and I would not be able to, really as fully have that experience. And so I would strongly suggest, if you are, going along reading that, and, do what thou wilt, for sure, but it's generally a pretty good practice to just skip them if you find them, because you might find that either, number one, you want to be respectful, or number two, that you might want to keep the potential for yourself to be initiated later. So those are some of the ways that I'll treat initiation. Unfortunately, I can't get into specifics. I've specifically taken oaths to not get into specifics, and I intend to uphold that. And I think that it's very meaningful when you find yourself upholding that. But, yeah, there's symbols in that. You're walked through a certain narrative that is intended to symbolically communicate a message of import to you. That's how that works. Let's see. Other narratives could include things like performances of things that are much more publicly symbolic. There's The Rites of Ulysses is a perfect example. Crowley wrote a series of what is basically 7 plays, each one themed on a specific planet or planetary energy. Yes, I understand that there are not 7 planets. It's the alchemical planets. It's the 7 objects that can be seen with the naked eye on the backdrop of the stars. Not even all of them are planets. One's the moon, one's the sun. But in alchemy, they call them the 7 planets, because traditionally that is what they called them. So the performance of the Rites of Ulysses are basically, there's a set of plays. Each one touches on a specific energy note, and each of the characters are embodiments of a specific type of energy, and as they interact, they interact as their character would, if that makes sense. And that's what the script and it kind of goes over. And so the narrative is this interplay of these energies. And the intention, as I understand, was kind of twofold. Number one was to raise attention towards the creation of the AA, to try to get people interested in this new organization now that the Golden Dawn was phasing out, this new magical organization, and try to get, some awareness. Hey, everyone, check out this. Look at this Rites of Ulysses thing. This is fun and interesting, and maybe you want to know more about this, So that was one intention. Another intention, as I understand, is that the belief is even just reading through the script is enough to rise a specific energy in the individuals towards a, as they called it, religious ecstasy, through that one particular elemental exploration, or planetary exploration, I guess. Other similar things to that. So that's like a play that you might go out symbolically watch. The interplay of those energies. Another thing that's kind of down that road is fictional stories. Symbols can definitely show up in fictional stories. Now, we're not talking about I don't know. I guess, and to some point, every fictional story has symbols in it. But in particular, we're talking about occult symbols. We're talking about actual spiritual symbolism. In the case of most fiction, I'm sure every author has taken the liberty of looking at something in their daily life, some person, some behavior, some thing, and kind of working it into their work. So I'm sure that, that particular dwarf that slayed that particular dragon was really, my buddy Dave, and the way he finally figured out his mortgage, or whatever. I'm sure there's some of those aspects to all fiction. When we're talking about fictional stories containing occult symbolism, we're talking about things that are purposefully set up, or that act as kind of how we were talking about how you can find symbolism anywhere, Sometimes it's not intended, but it acts as a really good symbol for exploring an idea. Sometimes it's intended. Sometimes the author is an occultist and writes a fictional story on purpose in order to convey through symbolism. An example of that, back to Crowley, would be Crowley's Moonchild. It's a narrative about this secret society, and they like are doing some ritual stuff, and there's like a goal in mind. And I don't want to get too into it because it's a good book. I don't want to spoil the narrative, but in the case of fiction, fiction is generally fictionalized, Hollywoodized. It's larger than life. They pump up the story, make it a little bit more because you're writing a book. You want it to be interesting. So there's definitely some of that, Moonchild included. But at the same time, there are both themes blatantly in the work where they talk about like doing LRP and those kind of things that are decently accurate towards the occult world, but there's also symbolism that's occurring within the characters and their dialogue and their interplay and the events that are happening that might be leading towards a specific conclusion throughout the story. So that would be an example of a fictional story that includes occult elements, occult symbols. Another one that I love, fantastic example of this, is a little bit more modern. There is a comic series that was made by Grant Morrison, the author Grant Morrison, called The Invisibles. The Invisibles is a series of comics that follow this character, and Grant himself has done public appearances. You can find a lot of these online, where he talks about how the intention with The Invisibles was that it was a sigil of sorts, and that as he was writing the comic, he was specifically putting in that intent for it to be a magical act. And sometimes he was writing the story for the sake of the story, and then things would happen in his life. And sometimes he wanted things to happen in his life, so he would write it into the story, and then it would happen. So there was this intention with the Invisibles comic series to be a sigil of sorts. And it also, just like Moonchild, it does touch on a lot of themes that are occult in nature. They do, certain kinds of meditative practices, and they talk about elemental symbolisms and all sorts of stuff. It's all in there. It's really fun, great fun read. And I would also, if you're interested in those kind of things, also take a look at Grant Morrison and some of his work towards just chaos magic in general and those kind of, elements. So that's kind of how, you might perform a narrative with symbols, religious texts, initiations, fictional stories, those kind of things. Another way that you might interact with symbols is to eat them. And I know this sounds kind of weird, but it's pretty common. I would say what they call it is a Eucharist. I would say the Eucharist is probably one of the most universal concepts in religious practice. So basically, a Eucharist is some food or drink that has been, through religious means, turned into a symbol, and then you ingest it. A common example would be the Catholic sacrament. That's a Eucharist. So they, have the blood and body of Christ in a wafer and a glass of wine. Both of those are symbols of the thing. And I think their perception on that, their belief, is that it's not a symbol, that it is literal. But for the sake of our conversation, we'll call it a symbol. There are other religions as well that do that. Hinduism, you'll offer food up to a specific god and then partake in that food. Thelema is a magical tradition that does a similar thing with the Gnostic Mass, which we touched on briefly. There is a sacramental aspect to it, a Eucharistic aspect to it, where there is what's called a cake of light, and there's a serving of wine, and you would imbue both of them with a symbolic meaning, and then ingest that symbol. Now, what that's doing is it's kind of playing on that whole concept of you are what you eat, and kind of playing on the concept of like, what is food? You know, when you eat food, you're taking that physically into your body, into yourself, you're breaking it down, it's being absorbed and passed throughout all of your system, and you kind of become that thing in a lot of ways. You know, you are what you eat, you start to become the cells of the things that you've broken down, and incorporate that into your being. So something that you might do with the Eucharist is, you know, something more like a traditional Mass setting. But something else that you might find yourself doing is maybe you, I don't know, bake a muffin or something. I see Wiccans do a lot of kitchen magic where they'll like symbolically create some, you know, they'll take some symbols of some things that they need in their life. They'll mix it into the food, and then they'll ingest the food, and it's kind of like inviting those things into your life. So if you need more, I don't know, like temperance or something, you could ingest a symbol of temperance and thus incorporate it into your being. So that's what a Eucharist is. It's also kind of known as a sacrament. I am unaware of a religion that doesn't have one at least in part somewhere. There probably is one. As soon as I start saying absolutes and putting them out on the internet, I'm sure either through natural means of the universe just presenting them to me, or internet folks spamming me with a million emails that tell me that I'm wrong. If I'm wrong, let me know. I want to know. You can reach me at nate@whitewoodpodcast.com. And yeah, if I'm wrong, maybe there is a religion that doesn't. I'm not aware of one. Every religion that I know has some form of sacred ingesting of a substance during some form of rite, ritual, something. And basically what you're doing is you're taking a symbol and you're ingesting it. So that's a way that you might work with symbols. Another way you might work with symbols is through like divinatory practices, divination, you know, tarot, runes, those kind of things. Each one of those is kind of a symbol for something. And you'd reach into, you know, the bag full of runes, or you would draw out your cards or whatever. Your subconscious is probably hyperfixated on something right now, and you don't understand that it is. Or maybe you do understand, I don't know. But it's most definitely hyperfixated on something, and it might be important and it might not. And basically that randomness that is pulling one of those symbols out of a bag or out of a deck can bring those concepts up to the front of your mind. And for some individuals, they believe that they can actually perceive future events by doing that. That's what divinatory practice is. But some people don't necessarily agree with that, and just agree that it's a great way of using some kind of random symbols being delivered to the individual so that their mind can attach on the thing that it's trying to bring to the forefront and bring it forward. So, for example, tarot cards are an accepted way of in psychology, in we call it in like treatment in the medical community, of bringing certain things to mind. So if you're in counseling, I'm not saying this is common by any means. I wouldn't say like, hey, everybody on this listening to this show, if you've ever been to therapy, they're doing this right now. Get ready for it. Definitely not what I mean. But there are counselors and therapists who will utilize the tool of tarot cards for individuals who are open to the idea, where they will, they'll say, hey, this is this symbol. What does that mean to you? And then as soon as you start answering, that's where like the communication with the subconscious starts to happen. It's like, oh, it's funny that you would draw that, because that kind of reminds me of insert idea that your subconscious was completely obsessed with and you didn't realize until it was brought to the forefront. So divination is definitely something that can be utilized with symbols, and your personal interpretation comes into whether that's just what your subconscious knows, or does your subconscious know the future and know more and all of that. That's up to your own personal interpretation. I'm not going to make that decision for you, but that's what that practice is. Another practice would be like symbolic change. We kind of talked a little bit when we were talking about altars and like shaving off part of, like you make like a clay you and then you shave off part of it. That might be an example of like symbolic change, where you take like a symbol, modify the symbol. Or you take a symbol and you interact it with another symbol. So like, let's say you want to bring like more passion into your life. So you take like a little you and you light it on fire, and maybe that's inviting that passionate flame to and maybe you take it through multiple symbolic changes. Maybe you start in one, you put it through one symbolic change and another symbolic change. And it's pretty common with alchemy and specific to have symbolic steps in a long form of change. So that might be something you consider as an option. And then the last method that I wanted to kind of circle back to, we touched very briefly on it, but I wanted to like really get into it as its own practice, as opposed to how I kind of tied it into something, is seeking symbols. Symbol seeking. This is potent. This is powerful. This is something that if you're not doing, you can get a lot out of your life by doing it. Remember, you get to pick what the symbol is. So I'm not necessarily telling you have to seek the same symbol that I seek. I'm just saying, hey, it's a pretty powerful practice to seek symbols in general. Pick whichever ones you're going to, liberate yourself with. So the way you seek a symbol is you say like, hey, I need I need more excitement in my life. I need excitement. And then you come up with a symbol of excitement. You say, man, a symbol of excitement is, like flashing lights or the color yellow or this particular type of animal or whatever the fuck, Find some symbol of whatever it is you're seeking. Maybe you're seeking love, and you say you seek out a specific symbol of love. It's super easy if it's Valentine's Day, but otherwise, maybe not so easy. And then you go leave your house, and you go walk around until you find it. Okay? So you're the symbol at that point. You're a symbol of your life, your will. You've shifted yourself into a symbol. It kind of goes back to that whole concept we were talking about a little while ago about as above, so below, right? You're just going up a layer instead of doing a symbolic thing on your altar with an action figure and going through life and whatever, right? Now you're doing it with you. You are going physically out into the world, and you're going to find a symbol. So you go to the mall, and you walk around until you find that thing that you're seeking. And then you go home. And then you do it again. You go out and you seek it again. You do this over and over and over again. And by actively seeking the symbol, what you are doing is you are becoming a symbol of your life, and your life is being oriented towards that goal that you are seeking. So if you pick something like, some positive change that you want in your life right now, you can go out and find it physically. And if you physically find the representation of it, you will start to find that energy enters your life and that your goal, your motivation starts to shift in that direction. So that's an example. And it's a fun example because people don't realize you're doing occult shit when you do it. Just be like, I'm just going to go to the park. And it is what it is. So that's like a really long, really big explanation on all the different kinds of things you can do with a symbol. And guess what? There's a million more. That is nowhere near a full explanation of everything that you can do. You can do a bunch more. That's just kind of, hey, here's some great options that you might consider. And many of these we'll do long form episodes on later. So, what symbols exist? What symbols? Yeah, we talked about how to use symbols. What symbols should you use? Well, the answer to what symbols you should use, I cannot answer for you. You should use whatever symbols work for you. I can tell you what works for me. I can tell you what works for some other people that I've talked to. But I can't necessarily tell you what's going to work for you. It's going to be based entirely on your response to a symbol. And we touched on that a little bit when we were talking about LBRP, where it's a very Judeo-Christian set of symbols. Maybe you don't vibe really well with that. Maybe that doesn't help you. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. You might do the exact same ritual in more of a Greek sense. You might do it in, more of a Egyptian sense, or maybe you don't want to use a pre-made system. That's okay too. So, I'm going to talk about some common ones that exist in the occult. But remember, you could also make your own symbols. I personally don't like to make my own symbols. I find that while I've done some experimentation and it definitely works, which brings a lot of questions as to how all this operates, it definitely works. It makes it difficult to work in groups, and it makes it difficult to work across time. So if I'm going to work with others, we have to be using a common set of symbols. And if I'm going to read old books in order to pull the meaning that they found out of their work, I need to use the same set of symbols that they use. It's kind of like symbols themselves are a language, and language is a set of symbols as well. So I guess really a lot more true than I think it is. But basically, the ability to communicate with others, that set of symbols, because we're using the same symbols, is very useful. Now, does that mean that you can't be like, man, fuck that, I'm making all of my own symbols up from scratch? No, by all means do it. It's definitely a practice. If you want to learn more about that practice, chaos magic is the art of doing that. They call it chaos magic because it's very chaotic, because each individual is, doing a completely different thing than the others, because they're making their own symbols. It's a very chaotic system. Definitely not a bad practice, and one that I strongly suggest people at least experiment with enough to see how it functions, because it'll give a little bit more depth as to how the longer form systems exist. So some examples of symbols that exist that are available for you to use in all of your workings, all of the different examples that I set up, was maybe like gods, spirits, mythological characters. So that's a pretty solid one, where you're using like a pre-built mythological system. Maybe you're pulling really heavily from Greek. Maybe there's like a lot of symbols. There's like a lot of gods that overlap really heavily across cultures. So like Hayagriva, for example, is a Hindu. It's the horse, the white horse god. Hayagriva is like a god of the form and fount of knowledge. He's a knowledge god, knowledge and writing and learning, and that could be knowledge like academics. We could be, like, hey, I'm trying to pass my college class. That might be a potential symbol to work with. But it could also be like more secret knowledges, written word and those kind of things. Down the exact same road is the Egyptian Thoth, sometimes pronounced Thoth, but as I understand the correct pronunciation, I don't know that we know the correct pronunciation for Old Egyptian. That might be part of the problem. Thoth is how I have heard it pronounced many times. Thoth is the ibis, that bird with a long curved beak. It's the ibis-headed Egyptian god. God of writing and messages and learning and those kind of things, right? Hermes is the Greek version of the same concept. He's movement, and the Roman version of him is Mercury. So movement and knowledge and written word and messages and those kind of things, communication, those kind of things. So you can see there's like some heavy overlap between these symbols. And so you might incorporate more than one of them. You might just work with one of them. You might build up a really strong relationship with one of them and then go, I would like to continue delving down this route, building this relationship with the divine, but I'm getting kind of tapped out on Thoth. I'm going to switch over to Hayagriva and see if I can get, if I can continue this delving into this symbol and how I can build a relationship long-term with it. So that might be kind of a potential in how you might use gods. You might also use gods in your rituals, in your masses, in your stories, or you might read religious texts that are about them and kind of formulate more of an understanding of them, and that might unfold certain aspects of the symbol. You might observe how they interact with the other gods around them, and that might help to unfold how this one particular thing in your life is interacting with this other thing in your life. So that would be a pretty obvious example of how you might use gods and spirits and entities and mythological creatures and, those kind of pre-established systems in order to, explore. Obviously, as you go down this route. The academic side of religious symbolism is really, really interesting. Again, YouTube, start looking up religious symbolism lectures. There are quite a few of them out there, and they're fantastic. And they can really help to drive home this, this meaning that's just under the surface with, oh, did you notice that this god slayed a dragon? What is the dragon symbolic of? His, you can dive into that. It's a lot of fun. Some common symbols that are used in the occult that are not tied into other religions would be like the elements. It's a pretty good example. Not that the elements is completely devoid of being in other religions. The Greeks had the same elements. There's some Eastern traditions that have elements or very similar elements. Basically, so the Wiccans have, I shouldn't say the Wiccans have, the Wiccans do a great job at educating individuals on the elements, but the elements themselves are something that show up in a lot of different cultures. I bring up the Wiccans because I have noticed that some other cultures don't dive as well into the education of what are these things, whereas the Wiccans do a very good job at focusing on those elements and really kind of diving into the specifics, building a real long-term relationship with one of the elements. So the 4 elements, earth, air, fire, water, the 5th being spirit, which kind of unites the other 4. You'll see these elements in many, many other places. There's Eastern representations of them. There's Native American representations of them. They're commonly out there. The basic idea is that we're not necessarily talking about summoning actual fire, but, fiery aspects of the self, the microcosm, that, passion and, brilliance and, those kind of things. You might, with earth element or air element, you might have other associations. Some of them are tied into specific directions, depending on culture, depending on which ritual you're using at the time. For example, the Golden Dawn had more than one set of directions. So in one ritual, they might have the east be air, and another ritual, they might have the east be fire. And that's definitely not a blind. There's some layers of symbolism that are on top of what they're talking about. They believed that those elemental directions change. Certain Native American cultures also have directions associated with elements or, stuff like that. So the elements being earth, air, fire, water, and sometimes spirit, depending on what culture you're looking at. Some other elements that exist out there for you to play with are the alchemical states. That could be the alchemical planets, which is and I recognize that some of these are not planets, but that's what they're called. So the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, those are all the objects that you can see with the naked eye that move across the sky that are not part of the backdrop that is the stars. They're the objects that move relative to our position. So those are generally the traditional alchemical planets. The alchemical, there's also alchemical forces of salt, mercury, sulfur. So those are some things where each one of those kind of has some symbolism attached into it. Sulfur is like this force that, begins anew and starts motion and those kind of things. Whereas, mercurial is more liquidy, flowy, constant state of flux changing. Salt being like more fixed, more crystallized energies, states of motion, basically. And the alchemical system of 3 also shows up in Eastern traditions. So there's other cultures that we're talking about very, very, very similar things using different words for it. But I think that's an interesting point. The horoscopes are another example. The horoscopes are, I would imagine most people have been exposed to the horoscopes in some fashion. In a modern day, we talk about them as like, oh, you were born when the sun was in Taurus. You're a Taurus, and we say like, oh, if you were born from this month to this month, that makes you a Taurus. there's definitely a lot more to horoscopes than that, and we'll do some episodes. I doubt that we can pull that off in a single episode, but we will definitely dive down the astrological route of trying to unpackage some of that information. But the horoscopes themselves act as symbols as well. You might do like a ritual to invoke, I don't know, Libra, and have Libra-like things happening around you. You know? So, yeah. So horoscopes can be another type of symbols. There's correspondences like animals and plants. You can find these written in a lot of different books. A fantastic example is 777 by and other Kabbalistic writings by Aleister Crowley. It was published by Rigardi, originally written by Crowley. There are a plethora of books for the pagan community and the Wiccan community, dealing with correspondences, like different plants that might correspond to one thing, or different animals, or colors, or tones of music even. There's even kind of books like the Quadrivium that start to dive into the specifics of musical note and artistic beauty, and the way that those can be symbols. And then we talked very briefly about the tarot. The tarot is a perfect example of a set of symbols. There are some that are positive, there are some that are negative. They're all just kind of all over the place. Many of them are neutral. And you might draw a card, and it might be a card that says death, but it's it's really a symbol of change, and it might be a tower, and that seems friendly. It's just a tall tower, but it's actually a symbol of absolute terrible things happening to you. So each one of those pictures can be symbolic of some kind of an event, and by working with the interpretation, you can come to symbolic understanding. So, wow, that is a lot. There was a lot of information. I feel like we shotgunned a lot of it out really fast, and hopefully that's some meaningful stuff that you can take with you in your life, and find that, I would remember that symbols is not necessarily only the occult. I would say that all religions are utilizing symbol as a form of getting closer to the divine, and that the occult is just another group of individuals who are finding meaning down that road. So, in conclusion, I strongly suggest that anybody who is interested in developing the skills and the relationship with those types of energies and getting better at it, strongly suggest going back to the basics and investigating what it means to be a symbol and how a symbol might be utilized. So, good luck, and we'll see you on the next episode. Thanks for listening to the Whitewood Podcast. This show is made possible by our Patreon members. You can find us on Twitter at Whitewood Show and on Facebook at Whitewood Podcast. For links to all our social media and information about our Patreon, visit us at whitewoodpodcast.com.